Okay, this morning we are going to start the book of 3rd John. And in 3rd John, the Apostle John is talking about encouraging the saints to do what is good and to be walking in the truth. This book, as far as what's about the book and its writing, because oftentimes this is one of those little books that really most people don't really pay much attention to. You know, it's a very small book. It's a very small letter, but some of the things that he's actually writing about are kind of important, especially in relation to the assembly and how it treats other people. So, of course, the author was the Apostle John. It's pretty clear from the context of what was written that it's the Apostle John. It's not so much that he specifically states it, except how he addresses it. The dating and the place of the writing, they're not really all that clear. I mean, there's not a lot of content within the letter to kind of identify it. However, because of the other letters that he wrote, 1st and 2nd John, more than likely it was written from Ephesus, where he was the pastor at this time. And we would put the writing of this probably somewhere around 90 AD, somewhere in there, which would be nearing to the end of his life, but where you have a lot of the impacts of his ministry that has spread throughout the whole region. Because there's a lot of assemblies that actually were, really John was teaching people and sending them out, and they were starting assemblies. You know, so we have that.
So was he in exile at this point?
He was not in exile at this point, I don't think. I think it was just before. Well, actually, I don't know on that one. I'd have to check, because he went into exile and then he was out of exile. And I think he actually passed. I don't recall, actually, because for some reason, I think it was in Ephesus where technically he would have passed away. So it wasn't in exile, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I'll have to verify that. He starts out from the elder. So this is an address that John specifically uses over in 3rd John chapter 1 and verse 1. Here he says, "The elder to Gaius the beloved, whom I love in truth." Now, this is the same address that he actually used in 2nd John chapter 1. And is one of the reasons why we can kind of see that it is actually the Apostle John who is writing, and just the way he's addressing people. So over in 2nd John chapter, or in verse 1, he also starts it out with the elder as how he's addressing it. Now, the elder term, of course, is often synonymously used with one who is a pastor. And this is the way that John is actually using this. We see an example of this over in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 2. Really, we'll go on through verse 4, but starting in verse 1, it says, "The elder who are among you I exhort. I am a fellow elder and a witness of the suffering of Christ." Now, of course, this is the Apostle Peter who's writing to them, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. Shepherd the flock. Now, that word shepherd is your word for pastor. And this is where we get that connection to one who is an elder is actually one who is shepherding. So he says, "Shepherd the flock of God, which is among you, serving as an overseer." Now, this, of course, then gives us the next connection, which would be what we oftentimes refer to as a bishop. Your term bishop is actually one who is an overseer. So we have pastors and those who have a spiritual gift of a pastor who are not necessarily in the position of a pastor within the assembly. But you don't have to be a pastor in an assembly to pastor. Not if you have the spiritual gift. It's a natural thing as people come around you, other Christians that is, you're going to naturally tend to shepherd them because of that gift that you actually have. But one who is a pastor can actually and should be in a position of an overseer, which would be a pastor of a church. Now, by the way, this does not restrict somebody as an overseer to just be one with the spiritual gift of a pastor. However, probably a pretty good idea to look for somebody who has that spiritual gift, because, you know, all the assistance that we could possibly have is better, you know, especially from the Holy Spirit. Because if you've got somebody who's able to do that, not by compulsion, but willingly. So you don't want to, nobody should be taking the position of a pastor by being pushed into it. And they should not be taking the position of a pastor for dishonest gain. And I think I've talked about this before, because I remember this with Multnomah and Western Seminary, and some of the students that were going there and talking about how much money they would be making in their career as a pastor afterwards. And it wasn't about the people, it was about how much money they were going to make. Apparently, both of those seminaries forgot to read this section of scripture. So, nor is being lords over it. Now, this is most seminaries don't teach this. Do you know that the pastor is not the CEO of the church? That's what it says. This is actually your word lording, as though you are the one who is in full authority. That is not the position of a pastor. They've been entrusted by being an example to the flock, so that when the chief shepherd appears, we will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. And we've talked about the glory of, or the crowns of saints, and one of them for a pastor is the crown of glory that is a proper opinion by a pastor who actually serves well. And keeping that in mind. It is also used of submitting to one who is older, and of course to each other. And a little bit farther down in verse 5, here it says, likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you submit to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble, in this sense. So, of course, there are those who are considered to be elders who aren't necessarily in the position of a pastor, too. But most of the time when you do see the concept of elders, and by the way, this would actually be one, and here in this context, I think it is actually talking about the specifically a pastor is submitting to that. But over in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 1, it's used of those who are older or mature. And this would be where it says, do not rebuke an older man or an elder, but exhort him as a father, young men as brothers. So it's talking about a relationship within the assembly. You treat those who are older as ones who are fathers, in the way that you speak with respect to them. And among the church, a young man, you treat them as brothers. Yeah, okay, so when I think of my brothers, it's like, well, but there are times where as brothers we were there for each other, and we should be there, as women as sisters, as younger women as sisters in purity. That should be the attitude of the church. So like I said, elder doesn't necessarily mean one who is in the position of a pastor, but be careful with that, because there is no scriptural justification for having an elder board in the church. Now, there's nothing wrong with it so long as that elder board is not governing the church, because that becomes unscriptural. Because who is actually to govern the church? It is actually the assembly that is the one that governs. So it's a congregational government. Now, there is nothing wrong with the assembly setting aside a group of men to handle the daily things that relate to the church at all. And they have the pastor who is there to basically determine what the saints should be taught and should be paying attention and making sure heresy is not getting in there. So he uses this, as, and in this context in 3 John, he is using it as he is in the position of a pastor. And he's taught a lot of people, and he's addressing specifically Gaius here. Now, Gaius, it's likely not Gaius of Derbe that traveled with Paul. We see somebody with the same name over in Acts chapter 20 and verse 4. This is not likely because more than likely, and we don't have a lot of information on him, but more than likely because as we go through the book, we're going to see the Gaius, or this particular Gaius that he's talking about, was a result of John's ministry and John teaching, and he went out and he was a part of another assembly. But here in Acts chapter 20 and verse 4, we have Gaius of Derbe and Timothy going along with Paul at this point. We actually have a whole list of people that actually were with him and decided to return through Macedonia when he was going that way. One of the saints in the assembly, like I said, that was started by the Apostle John is more than likely who he's referring to here. We don't have any other information on him about that. So then he begins to talk about prospering in all things, and of course, this is to Gaius as he's addressing it to him. Now, he does use a very interesting address here, which he doesn't typically use in other passages because we don't really oftentimes see the word beloved in evocative, and evocative means an address. So it's very, it's written in a way where typically what we would do is we would put an exclamation behind it because it's very direct. It's very much an address. So when he says beloved, he's actually kind of just stating it very abruptly. Beloved, I desire for you to prosper and be healthy concerning all things, just as your soul prospers. Of course, the word prosper here means to have a good way or a good path in the way that this particular word is actually referred to here. It's not a word that would typically mean being wealthy. This is one that just means your pathway is going to be one where it's good or it's beneficial. We see an example with Paul of his request to come to those who are in Rome over in Romans chapter 1 and verse 10, where here it says, making request if by some means now at least I may find a way in the will of God to come to you. And this concept of finding a way is where we see that my path may be good towards going to you, may prosper towards going to you, would be the context that he's actually referring to there in that prospering. The Corinthian saints are encouraged to give an offering weekly to store up as each one prospers. So it can be used of how we are actually in life, not just the direct path that we're going, but also just generally in life, how things are going for us. And we should be ones who are, of course, as we prosper. This, by the way, 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2 is specifically talking about those who they had made a promise to actually support some of the saints in Jerusalem. And Paul was saying, rather than me coming and collecting everything now, put it aside once a week and do it according to how you're prospering for that week. So you look at what you've actually got and what you're willing to give, and you set that apart. So that way it's not a burden when when he comes and he's like, hey, you made a promise, you need to keep your promise. And then it suddenly becomes a burden. And it's something, of course, we as Christians could learn from today. We should support our local ministry. It's not a tithe. If we're doing it as a tithe, really, if you really understand the concept of tithe, we're saying that we're under law. And since we actually live out from faith and not by law, and law is not out from faith, then a tithe would actually be a sin for a Christian. Yeah, actually think about that for a moment. You give freely, you take care of your own, what you have left over, how you've prospered, you provide as God sets it on your heart to actually provide. And that's what Paul is talking about here. Store up for that so that when he comes, he can collect it and it's not burdensome to anybody at that point. He doesn't want to be the one that says, hey, you guys made a promise, now you're going to have to cough up the money because you made the promise. And that really should, by the way, be as we as Christians, if we're going to make a commitment, we should actually commit to doing it, not just for words. But here it's interesting, he does say, as your soul prospers. So as your soul is actually prospering, he wants them to prosper. And this, of course, would refer to having a balance in your emotions, because he does actually use the word soul rather than spirit. A good way of our soul is to be controlled by our spirit, our rationale. Now, this is the word prosper. If your soul is going to prosper, it really should be controlled by your spirit, rationale. So your emotions should be put in check, because sometimes our emotions can cause us to do things that really we shouldn't be doing. You know, or a good example of this is we could get stressed over something like today, where we could potentially lose our job. But in the reality of that, when it comes down to it, we're finding out that, well, actually, it's more of a bluff than anything else. But we should not be reacting out of fear. You know, we should be reacting out of what is rational, standing up for the truth. And hey, if we have to pay for it, it's still the truth, and we know the end result of that. We need to keep that in mind and not let our emotions run away with us, not allowing fear to overtake us. Purifying our souls and obeying the truth. Now, of course, the purifying our souls, we want to remove those things that are actually problematic for us. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22 talks about this. And this, of course, is how we actually have a good way in relation to our emotions. Prosper. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22, since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. And you know, this is one where you don't have any other intentions, and you're purifying your soul. You're getting rid of the things that are problematic for you. You know, the things that war against our soul are fleshly things. And Peter also talks about that over in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 25, where he says, abstain from fleshly desires that war against our soul. Remember, the world system has to impact you through your emotions. It can't impact you through your rationale. Because if it actually starts to push towards your rationale, it has a problem. We're saved in our spirit. And we're going to start lining that up with who we are in Christ, and it's not going to work. So it needs you to emotionally react to something. And you can see this in advertising all over the place. You know, you deserve something. I see that in a lot of advertising. Oh, this is something that you deserve. Do you really deserve it? But it makes you feel good. Emotional response. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 25 says, for you were like sheep gone astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your soul. And I do not know where was I going on that one? I'm right in this area. Sorry, I grabbed the wrong verse. Where is that one where it says abstain from? Yeah, it's I'm gonna have to go look for it, because he's talking about specifically abstaining from worldly desires, and it's right in this area. And I think he talks about abstaining from Second Peter 2:14. Let's see what that one. 2 Peter 2:14 says, having fires full. No, this one specifically says abstain from fleshly desires which war against our soul, and it's right in this area.
How about 2:1?
And 2:1 specifically says, wherefore lay aside all malice and evil speaking. That's close, but he specifically says in verse 11 of 3,
2:11.
2:11, 1 Peter?
Yes.
1 Peter 2:11, where he says, dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against your soul. So that's what it should actually be. It should be 2:11 is where I was actually focusing on there. An unstable soul can be enticed to do things that are wrong. And remember, that word wrong is things that are not proper for us as Christians to be doing. They're not appropriate. They're not good things for us to be involved with. This is where 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 14, having eyes full of adultery that cannot cease from sin, enticing unstable souls. Okay, so they're ones who their eyes are full. And of course, he's talking about those who, these are false teachers that are coming into the church. And this is what they're actually doing. Enticing unstable souls, they have a heart trained in covetous practices and are accursed children. These unstable souls are being enticed by these people who are coming in and their eyes are full of adultery, and then they cannot cease to sin. And actually, somebody who cannot cease to sin is not a Christian. They're not Christians. Now, when it comes to our emotions, there's nothing necessarily wrong with our emotions. We just need to keep them in check properly. You know that we as Christians should actually be serving God with our emotions. Our emotions should be involved with it also. We're not just little robots who only think logical and, focus, we can't have any emotions in our relationship with God. That's not true. We just don't want our emotions to be what is leading us. Now, by the way, most assemblies today focus on emotions. They don't focus on rational, logical things. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 6 says, not with eye service. Now it's talking about how we, as ones who are serving others. Now, in the context here, he's talking about masters and servants, but today that can easily be taken over to somebody who is working for another person, their boss. Not as with eye servants, as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God, not from the heart. It actually uses the word soul here, from the suke. And that's important to pay attention to, because it's not saying from the center of you, it's saying from your emotional part also. Our emotions should be involved with it. And in doing that, of course, then our soul can prosper in a good way. As the soul prospers, that is, as the soul has a good way, we are going to also prosper. Our health is actually going to prosper. If you don't have emotions that are all over the place, it does actually directly impact your health, which is quite interesting. We actually see a few examples of this in Scripture, but more specifically, we know from, take for an example, laughter is medicine for the soul. Why is that statement there? Because oftentimes it is so true. Getting somebody to be encouraged in their emotions has a direct impact on them. He then goes on to talk about hearing of their conduct, because he's hearing it from, of course, other people who are coming to him. And this is verse 3, and he says, for I greatly rejoiced when brethren came and testified concerning you in the truth, just as you walk in the truth. So he's actually seeing them walking in the truth. Same kind of concept that he wrote about in 2 John, where he's so encouraged by hearing that they're actually walking in the truth. They're seeing things as they really are, and they're actually manifesting that. So there are brethren who have come to him that actually are testifying of this fact, that they are walking in the truth. The brethren are testifying concerning them and that they are walking in the truth. And then he talks about the joy that this actually brings him, because it brings him a lot of joy that they are actually doing this. And this would be in verse 4. He says, I have no greater joy than this, in order that I should hear my children walking in the truth. So he's hearing them walking in the truth, and as a result of that, he actually does have joy. Now, John sees this as success among the assemblies, by the way, is walking in the truth. It's interesting, John never addresses an assembly in relation to its size. He always looks at how they're walking in the truth. And that is more important. That's what brings him joy, is they're walking in the truth. By addressing them as his children, of course, this would indicate most likely that he is the one who is ultimately the founder of that assembly. Now, not directly, but more than likely by the people that he taught and sent out. And he sees himself as a father to them, and them as his children, as part of his ministry. And of course, as part of his ministry, when he hears that they're actually walking in the truth, that brings him joy. There's contentment involved in that, and that work that involved in the ministry. Because, to be honest with you, sometimes the work in the ministry can be very difficult. And difficult in the sense that sometimes it doesn't appear like there's a lot of impact. But when you hear that there is impact, it's actually very, very good to hear that, to see that. And it's the same thing with us, because sometimes in church, we tend to go over the same things, or it appears that we go over the same things over and over again as we go through God's scripture. But if we're paying attention and listening and learning to apply it to our lives, all of a sudden we come into a situation where it's like, I know how to actually deal with that situation properly. And it brings joy within us, because we're like, I got this one. And not me by myself. I got it because I know full well where my strength comes from. Where I can have victory over it. And then he talks about doing what is faithful, being the one that is known to keep their word. Beloved, now again, he addresses them very abruptly, beloved. So he's wanting to draw attention. You do faithful things, which if you should work for the brethren, also unto the strangers. So the brethren, of course, in the context here, he's talking about specifically those who are within the assembly that he is in. And then the strangers in the context that he's referring to are other Christians that are coming through, that are passing through, and they're not known. So he's not just talking about unbelievers. The word stranger is not a reference to unbelievers. In the context, he is talking about other believers. They just don't know him directly. So John is encouraging Gaius to be faithful in his work towards the brethren, of course, and then also doing this same work towards those who are actually strangers coming in. And like I said, in the context, we're going to see that he is talking about other Christians. We are to be hospitable to strangers. Romans chapter 12 and verse 13 talks about this. Distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. Now, your word hospitality here is actually literally one who is fond of strangers. Now again, the context is not talking about, because the assembly isn't for the unbelievers. It's talking about believers from other areas that come in, and maybe they're passing through and they join our assembly for a Sunday or something as they're moving on. We should actually be ones who are friendly, fond of having them around. Now, like I said, the context is actually going to show us exactly why he's addressing this. So some have actually, by the way, been hospitable to messengers without knowing it. Okay, so somebody who is actually sent on, and they are, it does talk about, some of our translations over in Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2 uses the word angels. But is he talking about specifically angels, or is he talking about those who were given instructions to send a message? There's a good question there. Angels are ones who actually do serve us as ones who are to be saved. So it could very well be an angel that you're not even aware of. Yeah, that's right. Angels don't have wings. They look like regular human beings when they appear to us. We can't see them in their spirit form. That we don't have the ability right now to actually see spirit. Our physical bodies don't have that capability. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2. Love the brethren, or let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, and that means be fond of strangers. For by so doing, some have unwittingly or unknowingly entertained angels. Now, it shouldn't be a focus on, well, maybe this person is an angel. Well, maybe this person is just somebody who is another saint, or somebody who is doing work for an assembly, and they might be actually going to another assembly taking a message, because that's literally what your word messenger means. And they might not even necessarily be telling you what they're doing, but you're helping them along. Now, again, in the context of John, the third John, he is talking about saints who are coming through that region that are being helped along to to whatever the mission that they're on, they're being assisted to go further and accomplish that. Then he talks about those testifying concerning him, which would be Gaius, who testify concerning you. Now, it's not just the brethren, but it's also the strangers, the people that he doesn't know, but they're fellow Christians, who testify concerning you in love before an assembly, whom you do well, sending forward worthy of the God. So you see what he's doing is these strangers are coming in, and he's actually taking them in, he's taking care of them, and he's sending them forward in a worthy manner, or sending them on their journey in a way that would be worthy of one who belongs to God. So like I said, these are the brethren and strangers, which would be unknown saints, and they're testifying concerning his love. He sent them forward in a worthy manner. He showed them hospitality, and he sent them forward in a worthy manner. And as a result of that, they actually talked about him. Now, these are the ones who went out concerning the name. And this is why I'm saying these specific strangers are referring to other Christians. This is in verse 7 where it says, for concerning the name, they went receiving nothing from the Gentiles. Now, I know some of our translations, I think they say the name of Jesus there, but it actually isn't in the original. It just says the name, and the way that it actually expresses it, to be honest with you, I don't think it really is necessary to say the name of Jesus. I think that by John, the way that he's expressing this, he's making it very clear that it is the name, the only one we should be going out from, no other. So he's being very emphatic when he's using it this way. So the name would be referring to Christ. They took nothing from the Gentiles. There was no collection plate. They didn't come to the assembly and expected a collection so that they can move on. And these are ones that took nothing from the Gentiles, which more than likely meant that they were actually Jews who were coming out and spreading the message. Now, these would be Jews who have become Christians, so they're part of the church. Because the way that Paul addresses them is they're not actually taking anything from the Gentiles. They're not there for the Gentiles' money. They're there to bring them the truth, and they're not focusing on that. Because of this, we are obligated to support them. The assembly would be obligated, as these are people who are coming in a proper way. Verse 8, therefore we are obligated to receive these ones in order that we should become fellow workers in the truth. Now, of course, in supporting them, like with Gaius, could simply be welcoming into your home, giving them a hot meal, a place to sleep, maybe not. Maybe it's just a hot meal and send them on their way. That's all they needed. Or refreshing what they actually, in our, I'm trying to pull it over to things in relation to our world today, giving them a tank of gas or giving them something along those lines. It's just being hospitable towards saints, being ones who are, and you don't necessarily even have to give financially, it's just being open to them, bring them in, take care of what they need. We receive them, and by receiving them, we're actually supporting their work. We're actually involved in the work that they're doing, and we're supporting it. Of course, remember, in the second letter of John, he said, do not get involved with those who bring a false doctrine. Don't even associate with them. Don't let them into your house. Because in doing that, you're actually associating with their work. It's the same thing with those who are saints, taking care of them and providing for them. Now he then addresses an issue in the assembly. There's a particular problem that and part of this is why he's writing. I wrote to the assembly, but the one fond of preeminence among them, Diotrephes, would not receive us. So here we have one who is rejecting John, the Apostle John, and those that he's actually sending. He wasn't going to accept them at all. He refuses to actually receive them. And he does this because he wants the preeminence. Now, this does tend to indicate that Gaius is assisting the saints apart from the assembly, by the way. because more than likely, Gaius is a member of the assembly, but not necessarily a pastor. There isn't any indication that he's even in a position of authority within the assembly, but the one who is in position of authority does not want to receive those that John is actually sending out. So his desire is to be the leader, of course, and this would be the one who's refusing them. Diotrephes, he really wants to be the leader. He wants to take the position of an apostle. He's not accepting other pastors to come in. And, I have seen this even today where we get people, especially in smaller assemblies, where, another pastor can't just come in and just be with them. It's always this, they're eyeballing the pastor like they're going to come and they're going to steal their people away. There's even a reference to that, fishing in somebody else's pond. Well, the reality is, if we're actually true Christians, we're in the same pond. It doesn't really matter because Christ is the one who is the head. And we should be willing to actually accept other pastors. This, by the way, is one of the things that when it came to some assemblies in other countries, it was always something that, although I find it a little awkward, it was still something that was more in line with what this was, is where you go, even in today, even in America, if I go into certain assemblies from certain countries and they find out I'm a pastor, they immediately want me to speak, to share a word with them. And the pastor will step aside. He's like, no, you come, you share a word. And it's showing an openness, not a threat. It's like, hey, you're another pastor, come and speak. And it's kind of the same thing at this point. Assemblies were a lot smaller, as the church is beginning to grow, they were a lot smaller, and you would have pastors come through, and they might be traveling, they might be going around, and they might be pastoring multiple assemblies, because there's just not enough pastors to go around, and they're coming and they're I remember this too with a lot of others from the seminaries, pastors who would talk about their travels around, and they meet other assemblies, or they join them for the Sunday because that's the area that they're in, and they find out they're a pastor. And sometimes they want them to speak, and sometimes they don't want anything to do with us. Well, the problem here is they didn't want anything, this particular person didn't want anything to do with anybody else who was bringing something, because he wanted to be the sole source of truth for those people that were in his assembly. That's really what he wanted to be. And we get that today, which is not an appropriate thing for a church, and especially not appropriate for a pastor. So Diotrephes will be called out for his actions. And this is verse 10. Because of this, if I should come, I will remember concerning him the works which he does, with malignantly evil words and slandering us. This is a pastor that's doing this. Okay, he's using malignantly evil words. So he's not just talking about, refusing them. He's spreading false things about them, trying to justify his work. And not being content concerning these things, neither would he receive the brethren, and forbid the ones determining, and cast them out of the assembly. So the ones that were saying, hey, no, these are actually people who are coming from the Apostle John. They're coming from the church in Ephesus. We should receive them. He would cast them out of the assembly. I mean, how shameful is that? And he's going to be called out by John if John is permitted to he's able to come. So in speaking of evil words and refusing the brethren and kicking those out. Then John goes on to say, do not imitate those who are wrong, or don't imitate the wrong. It's really important for us as Christians to pay attention to that. Again, he addresses it very abruptly. He says, beloved, he's trying to draw your attention back up. Pay attention. Do not imitate wrong, but imitate that which is good. Do not imitate the wrong, but good. The wrong here would be that which lacks in character. doing things that are wrong. Now, this particular pastor was doing wrong things. So don't be involved. Don't mimic that. The one doing good is out from God. The one doing wrong does not discern God. He doesn't see God with discernment. He's not paying attention. So wrong is something that we should not be imitating, but we should actually be doing the things that are beneficial. That's your word good that's actually being used there. Because the ones who are doing wrong, they're not seeing God. And then we have Demetrius that is actually addressed here specifically in verse 12. And he says, Demetrius, he is testified of from all of you and from the truth itself. And we also bear witness, and you intuitively know this is that our witness is true. So Demetrius, he actually has a very good testimony. And he was more than likely one of the saints there also. And he had a good testimony, not only from Paul, but also, John. And they know that his testimony is true, that he is actually in relation to how they're coming. And then Paul is actually desiring to, or I keep saying Paul, John, let me get this right. John is actually then expressing his desire to actually come to visit them. And this is in verses 13 and 14. I have many things to write, but I do not desire to write to you through ink and pen, but hope to come to see you, and we should speak face to face. Peace to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends according to the name. It's kind of how he ends this. Now, I know there in some translations, there's actually a verse 15, but it'll basically ends the same way. So the Apostle John starts out with expressing, addressing the letter, saying he is the elder. This is from the elder, and he's expressing that. And then he's talking to Gaius directly, or he's writing to Gaius directly, and he's talking about, the fact that he really does desire. It actually uses a word that word desire is actually a word vow in communication. Okay? But it's his desire in the sense that his communication to God would be that in expressing that desire that he would prosper, but according to how his soul prospers, which of course means that when his emotions are properly in check, the rest of him is also going to be prospering in a good way. And he did hear of his conduct, not only his conduct, but others that were actually there, and the fact that it did bring John joy when he heard, especially that they're talking, or they're walking according to the truth. It's so important. They're walking according to things as they really, seeing things as they really are. Then he encourages them to do what is faithful. Be ones who are trustworthy in that sense. We as Christians, that's something that is so true even today. We should be true to our word, being faithful. The ones that everybody knows they can rely upon. And of course, they have those who are testifying concerning him specifically that came in and said, yes, he is one who, even though the pastor of their assembly was refusing them and actually casting anybody out who would receive him, Gaius actually was taking them in, and he was taking care of them. And he was making sure they were sent upon their way properly. And these, of course, as we were talking about, these strangers that he's referring to, are the ones who were sent out, and they were the ones going out concerning the name. And that's pretty clear from context. The name is actually Christ. Now, those who are actually sent out this way, we as saints are obligated to take care of them. When a stranger comes in, we should be hospitable towards them. Take care of whatever they need, send them on their way. And then he addresses the assembly or the issue that is in the assembly with their pastor. And, he's telling him, don't imitate what is wrong. What he's doing was wrong, was very wrong, and was very obvious. And if John was able to come, he would actually remember his actions, and no doubt would have publicly have intentionally done that before the saints so they could see that this man needed to be corrected and probably removed from his position. And then he talks about Demetrius and the witness that he actually has, and then his desire to actually come. So a small letter, but actually something that's really important for us today to remember, as other saints come through, and sometimes they are just traveling through, we should be hospitable towards strangers. It's not addressed to unbelievers. It's not bringing unbelievers into the assembly, because so often, again, that's the focus of a lot of assemblies today, where they bring in unbelievers and they ignore the believers. We should not be doing that. We should be taking care of our own, and when other saints come around, be hospitable towards them.